Chapter 4, Key Issue 2, starts on page 116. And Chapter 4, Key Issue 2, will look at the reasons for the distribution of clothing styles in folk and popular culture. It'll look at folk food preferences and taboos for food, regional variations in food preferences, the factors that influence patterns of folk housing, and we'll look at in the notes a little bit about housing styles in the United States, but I want to work on that mostly in class because it can get, I think, a little complex for a video lecture. So we'll look at some pictures and I'll give you a handout in class about that. So Chapter 4, Key Issue 2, focuses primarily on material culture. So things like clothing, food, and shelter. Just like with leisure activities in the first section, folk material culture is going to diffuse slowly through a process of migration. So it's going to diffuse through relocation diffusion. And then popular material culture is going to diffuse rapidly, usually through either hierarchical diffusion or sometimes contagious diffusion. And again, the access to material culture in pop culture is going to be usually the only limit to your access is, again, having enough money to buy the things you want. So folk clothing preferences. These are styles of clothing that are usually worn in response to either agricultural practices or to climatic conditions. So you're often going to find like elements of environmental determinism within folk clothing. And again, it's not that people are limited and can only do something because of their environment, but you're certainly going to find, maybe not determinism, but certainly you're going to find that environmental preference. So things like wooden shoes or clogs, which you've probably seen, if not on someone in the real world or a real pair you've seen in cartoons or in pictures. These wooden clogs are a folk custom in the Netherlands, and it makes sense. Before there were rubber boots or plastic shoes, if your shoes were primarily made out of leather, and the Netherlands are wet. Remember we talked about them making the polders, the raised lands, and so they could farm over their wetlands, and the use of levees and dikes and canals. So Netherlands is wet a lot. Wooden shoes didn't rot as fast, and so it makes way more sense to have wooden shoes in a wet climate. If you are in an Arctic climate, you're going to have fur-lined boots. Fur-lined boots will protect against the cold and help keep your feet dry. So folk clothing will often reflect climatic conditions or agricultural practices. It'll make sense based on the practices of your community. Popular clothing preferences usually reflect things like your occupation or your income. So popular culture clothing preferences aren't really geared towards matching your environment. So if you are wealthy, you have expensive designer clothes, or you have access to them. You don't have to wear them, I guess. If you are working in certain occupations, your clothing will match that. So if you're a lawyer and you're going to court, you're wearing a suit. If you're a doctor and you're working in a hospital, you're wearing scrubs, right? If you're a doctor working in your doctor's office, you usually just have on your lab coat. If you do like construction, you usually wear like Dickies pants or jeans. And so popular cultural preferences can go along with your occupation and your income. And here's a picture of the wooden clogs if you've never seen them. Where are folk and popular leisure activities distributed? Popular clothing styles are rapidly distributed across the world. So we have access to electronic communication, and this leads to rapid diffusion. So think about what it would have taken. So let's go back to like that distance decay. Remember we talked about distance decay a little bit. So if it takes a long time for you to travel, it takes a long time for you to share that idea. And the idea of time-space compression with advances in travel technology, so planes and faster ships and cars, and these things mean that distance decay shrinks. Just like access to electronic communication, so the TV and internet, they also reduce the amount of time it takes to spread something. So distance decay is less now because of time-space compression. So instead of waiting for women's dresses to be designed in Paris or London and then slowly making their way to stores, it can happen pretty quickly now. Although still, like in order for me to afford something that was on the runway in Paris, it still takes a couple years for it to be, in Target, which is where I would buy it. Jeans are an important symbol of the diffusion of Western culture, and there's certainly local diversity, and so different countries might have different styles, but blue jeans were something that spread globally, probably first through hierarchical diffusion, and then really it blew up into probably contagious. Folk and popular culture food preferences. People tend to adapt their food preferences to the conditions in which they live, and this preference is more marked in folk culture because you wouldn't have access to the spread of other materials. So if you look at like traditional foods for a region or a country, you'd see that in Asia, rice is a common food, right? And rice grows in milder climates. It needs it to be warm to grow. It has a really long growing season. And it needs moisture. So anywhere that's, pretty temperate or pretty warm most of the year and has lots of water, that's somewhere you can grow rice, and that'll be reflected in your cultural food practices. Whereas wheat has a shorter growing season, and it can't be grown in standing water, so it needs to be in a drier region. Obviously, you could have like seasonal rains to water the plant, but it needs to be dry enough for the wheat not to spoil once they harvest it, and it can't be grown in standing water. And so in areas like Europe, you're going to find cultural foods that reflect wheat. Same thing in Asia, in areas that have that are drier and a little colder, you're going to find that they traditionally grew more wheat there, and their local food customs might revolve more around like noodles made from wheat than from rice. In Italy, because there were less forest, you'd find like traditional foods that had quick frying foods because they didn't have as much wood when they were, cooking over a fire, like a wood fire. So in most of Italy, you're going to find foods that are cooked a little faster over heat. Where in Northern Europe, you're going to find traditional food culture revolving around like slow stewing and roasting of foods because they had larger forests. So larger, more abundant forests means they had a bigger wood supply, which means that their food could be, cooked slower over an open fire for a longer period of time. Not only do different cultures have different preferences, but there's also taboos. So a taboo is something that people avoid. It's against their custom. And if you do it, it's going to have, it just almost universally throughout the culture is something that's avoided. So because folk customs can attribute signatures or distinctive characteristics to things in nature, you can get food taboos associated with that. And you can also find some environmental causes for food taboos. So some like logical, environmental, and economic reasons that kind of grew into a custom. So some people might think that some foods have perceived beneficial or harmful natural traits. So in the Bible, ancient Hebrews were forbidden to eat animals that did not chew their cud, or that did not have cloven feet, and fish that did not have fins or scales. In Muslims traditionally don't eat pork. Hindus don't consume cattle. So why? Let's go into some background for that a little bit. It makes sense that, so let's look at like the pork taboo in both Judaism and in Islam. So the ancient Hebrews would have been nomadic people, and so you could have raised cattle in a nomadic lifestyle, but you can't really raise pigs. And so the only way you could have really had access to pork if you, were living in the time of the ancient Hebrews, you would, you'd have to buy it, you'd have to trade for it, and it could have spoiled and gone bad. And so, this taboo could have developed out of like a practice of not buying something that would easily be tainted and could make you sick. In areas where the Islamic faith originated, raising pigs uses a lot of water and resources, and those are resources that people would have been competing with, right? So they weren't nomadic like the ancient Hebrew people were, but pigs still use like a lot of water and they eat a lot of food, and so you're competing with resources. So again, you didn't really want to raise pigs, and so in order to get pork, you would have had to trade for it, and without refrigeration, the same problem. it could go bad. So this taboo could have originated from this environmental problem. Like we're not able to raise this animal. When we trade for it and eat it, we get sick because it spoils. The taboo against consuming cattle in the Hindu religion really can originate for how useful cattle were. So if you're a herdsman, if you raise cattle, you don't want to slaughter them and eat them because you need them. So you have a diet that depends on milk and cheese and cream. And milk and cheese and cream are common elements in Indian food. You can also, some cultures will make like soup from the blood of cattle, but they won't slaughter the cow. And so in India, they were using their cattle for dairy products. So it would have been wasteful to, slaughter and eat a cow. They used cows to pull carts, so they would have lost their method of transportation. They wouldn't be able to move their goods around. And in some areas of India where they weren't heavily forested, dried cow patties, right, were used as fuel. In their home, it's what they would cook with, is these like dried out patties of, cow dung. So to slaughter a cow for food meant that you maybe wouldn't have fuel, you wouldn't have any way to transport yourself or goods, and you wouldn't have access to a daily source of food. So killing a cow for food didn't make much sense. And eventually, because so much of the economy, like their personal economic values, relied on these cows, eating them became taboo. When you look at popular food culture, there's differences between countries. So in the Soviet Union, Pepsi was permitted for sale in the country when it was the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of them switched to Coke because they associated Pepsi with communism, and they didn't sell Coke when it was communist, so they switched. And cola preferences can be influenced by religion. In Israel, right, where it's predominantly Jewish people, they sell Coke, and so many Muslim countries will boycott Coke because it's sold in Israel. There's regional differences with our food in the United States too. So you might choose a beverage or snack based on what's grown, produced, or imported locally. So even within the United States or within the world, places that have vineyards and can raise grapes for wine becomes a more important part of their culture. If you live in an area that's highly religious and doesn't advocate drinking alcohol, you're going to have less alcohol sold and less alcohol produced in that way. If you are like in Texas, food influenced by Hispanic culture became popular first because of its, location near Mexico. And there's just preferences based on where you can find different restaurants. As far as housing, I want to kind of go over the different housing patterns in class. So read through it so you have some background knowledge. Know that folk housing can be based on what materials are available. So do you have wood or do you have to make brick? The design in villages can reflect your folk culture. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into religion. These show you different styles of houses in China based on building materials and folk culture. And the orientation of the home might reflect your desire to embrace your sacred spaces. So the eastern wall of a house can be sacred in Fiji. Houses in the south central part of Java face south because of the direction of the South Sea goddess. Where do you put your door? What do you do with corners? So all of these things can reflect different religious practices. And here you can see in Laos they set their houses up very regimented. They have exactly 150 meters between the house and the river because they don't want to be too close to the river for their cultural practices. But here in Thailand, do you see how they don't have their houses lined up because they believed, maybe not today, but traditionally they believed that spirits traveled in straight lines. And so if you had your houses kind of offset like this, the spirit would have to curve around and they wouldn't be able to, take over your home. As far as the U.S. housing styles, again, we're going to do that in class, so we'll go over it together.